Now, the Correctional Services Department is today expected to announce whether former President Jacob Zuma will return to prison or not. It comes after the Constitutional Court last month dismissed Zuma's application to challenge a Supreme Court of Appeal ruling which found his release on medical parole was unlawful. This after he was sentenced to 15 months in jail for defying a court order to testify at the state capture inquiry. But Zuma was released only 2 months into the sentence. Some have linked the July 2021 unrest to Zuma's arrest, which saw widespread looting and over 300 deaths in KwaZulu-Natal and in some parts of Gauteng. Right, let's unpack this further with legal analyst Benedict Phiri. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. Right, so let's look at where we are right now. There have been some court challenges to the legality of the release on parole. Is that matter now cleared and sorted out, or have all parties accepted the ruling of the courts and there is no one who's challenging the legality of this release?
Yeah, I think as it stands, it's very clear that the medical parole that was afforded to Mr. Zuma was unlawful. And certainly every party has accepted that. There's certainly no other challenge that lies to any other court from any of the parties. The question is then what happens now that the medical parole is unlawful. We know that the Supreme Court of Appeal said that the effect of that is that in law, Mr. Zuma has not completed his sentence and he should go back to Escort Correctional Facility to do so, and that the Commissioner may consider any grounds for his early release if he is empowered to do so or an application is made on that basis. So that was really where we got out after the Constitutional Court judgment a few weeks ago. What has since transpired is that the Commissioner has then called for representations from interested parties, essentially to work out how he is to deal with the question of whether he may afford Mr. Zuma an early release or not. We obviously don't know what's in those representations, but we wait with bated breath to hear how the Commissioner dealt with those in whatever decision he'd come to that he's promised to announce this evening or today rather.
So the public consultation process was around whether or not the Commissioner should consider the former president for early release. What are the permutations? What is he looking at? What would guide him in making that decision?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is obviously the actual Supreme Court of Appeal judgment. So I think what each of the parties will do will basically give him an interpretation of what the judgment required him to do. I think from my perspective, certainly the judgment required that Mr. Zuma first goes back to prison, and then from there any application can be made for his early release to the extent that the Commissioner may be empowered to do so. And I think that would then entail the second bit of the representations, or the aspects that he would consider would be what are the powers that are afforded to him under the Correctional Services Act to grant Mr. Zuma some kind of early release from incarceration. And he'd look at the type of factors that are afforded by the Act that would give him those powers. It is questionable whether he has those powers, but certainly that's the kind of space he would want to go to satisfy himself so that whatever decision he makes is not challenged by aggrieved parties later.
So far, what I know, and of course what I know is very limited as far as the legal space is concerned, at least is what we've been exposed to, is that we've got something that could be called presidential pardon. We've got something that would be called medical parole, which would be a way in which you would be released early from finishing your sentence, which is something that has now been contended in courts, and it was established that this particular one would not be applicable here. And then you've got your general parole as well, that happens after having served a third of your sentence. Are there any other dispensations that would allow for early release?
Certainly not that I'm aware of, in the effect that Mr. Zuma would seek, in the way he'd want to live as he's living right now. I think those are the three dispensations that would give effect to that. And obviously the presidential pardon is something that's in the remit of the president and not in the remit of the commissioner in the sense that medical parole and ordinary parole are.
So would, for example, that require a presidential pardon, that is? Would that require the commissioner to apply to the president or the Minister of Correctional Services and Constitutional Justice to apply to the president for that consideration? And what would that process entail?
I'm not very clued up on that process, Thabo, to be honest, but I certainly know that that is a power afforded solely to the president to consider. So whatever decision that would be made would sit solely with the president, and it's a power that is effectively unfettered that he can utilize. As to how the process would be triggered, I'm not entirely certain, but certainly that is a power that the president has, much to an unfettered degree.
So let's turn back to this now, because much of the debate is, one, firstly, the fact that the president says, well, I didn't release myself on parole, right? It was Correctional Services that took this decision to release me on medical parole. And I was not necessarily free because there were limitations and conditions that were put on me as far as that is concerned. So essentially, I was almost under house arrest. I think that's what he's implying. So I was still serving my term even in this period. How legitimate is that claim?
Well, I think the first one, we know that, the Supreme Court of Appeal has said it's not legitimate, right? It doesn't matter that the commissioner gave Mr. Zuma the medical parole. The fact of the matter, it was unlawful. So that first reason will not fly. I think the second reason may be a factor for the commissioner to consider if it is placed before him. But also the question is, first and foremost, if you interpret that Supreme Court of Appeal judgment correctly, I think that kind of consideration or argument or factor can only be put forward by Mr. Zuma, at least after he's actually behind bars. And it's not something to be made in this particular instance. So certainly I think the commissioner would have considered that in the weighing up of these various submissions that have been made by some of the parties, but I don't think those are likely to be the strongest ones, given how I think you should interpret the court order to at least have Mr. Zuma back in incarceration first and then move from there.
And is the decision of the commissioner challengeable? Can he be taken on review? Whatever it is, if it decides to put him back into prison or if it decides not to put him back into prison, is that a decision that can be taken on review?
I think, from Mr. Zuma's perspective, if the commissioner decides that he should be put back into prison, I do not think that Mr. Zuma could then take that on review, because what the commissioner will say is that he was giving effect to the strict letter of the judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeal. I think that's quite a defensible position for the commissioner to take if Mr. Zuma is incarcerated. I think the position is slightly different if Mr. Zuma is not incarcerated, because I think there'll be question marks initially around, was the commissioner entitled by the court order to firstly go this route in which he obtained these submissions. I think there may be a reason to sort of quell emotions and, sort of allow the parties to find each other in a sensible manner, etc. with this process. I think it may have served a good purpose from that perspective, but I think, the basis upon which it's done from a legal perspective, I think is not necessarily the strongest when you look at the terms of the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment. So certainly from that perspective, if we end up with a situation where Mr. Zuma is not incarcerated, I think there will be challenge to that particular, or rather let me say there may be challenge to that particular decision on a number of bases, including the process that has been adopted, or if it is irrational, or people could say it's not empowered by the Correctional Services Act, or the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment. So if we don't see Mr. Zuma incarcerated, there's certainly more room and scope for challenge. But if he is incarcerated, I think the room for challenge is actually almost not there.
Benedict Phiri, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your analysis this evening. By the way, we still await that decision from the Acting Correctional Services Commissioner, Makoti Tobakale, who is said to be making, or at least have told us will be making that announcement today still. And today still has a couple of hours still left.